As a general rule, the more complex your report design, with complex charts and other graphic elements, many levels of grouping and nested elements, and so on, the more complex the data structures exported by the data exchange renderers are going to be. And here's where report design can be tricky. You'll rarely be able to design a complex report that is optimized for both printing and online viewing, as well as for exporting the raw data. If you find yourself in this situation, it might be wise to create two versions of the report, one for printing to dazzle its readership, and another with minimal formatting as a means to put the simplest form of the raw data into the hands of users. All right, first format I want to talk about is CSV. The comma-separated values file format is a common data exchange format. The report data exported in this format consists of a series of rows with values separated by commas, with a header row that contains the names of the fields in the row. The header row is optional. Each header and data row is terminated with carriage return line feed characters. And the data includes all of the detail rows from the report, including data hidden when you perform the export, as long as they're able to be toggled to a visible state. So that's an important consideration. As long as the report can toggle them to a visible state, then that data is exportable to the data exchange formats. Values in each row that contain structural delimiters, such as a comma or a line break character, are going to be enclosed in double quotation marks as a text qualifier by default. Now, because this renderer exports only the data of a report, it doesn't include any report items other than the detailed data. This means that anything you place in the report header or footer, pretty formatting data like lines, images, and rectangles, totals and subtotals, and all interactive report features won't be represented in the output file. But data from different report areas is probably going to be exported. So it's something that, as your report design gets more complex, you'll need to play with if your users need to export in this CSV format. Now, where the CSV renderer gets tricky is that each report item type has its own rendering behavior. This is where you, as the report designer, can make life easy or complicated for the users exporting data from a report. Each item in a report renders as a separate group of records in the CSV output file, each with its own rendering behavior. Now, the source of the information here is the Books Online topic exporting to a CSV file. So take a look at that topic for the version of reporting services that you're using. All right, text box. This renders the contents of the text box itself. In a default mode, items are formatted based on the item's formatting properties. In compliant mode, a couple different modes you can work with, formatting can be changed by device information settings. A table is rendered by expanding the table and creating a row and column for each row and column at the lowest level of detail. Subtotal rows and columns don't have column or row headings, and drill-through reports aren't supported, which makes sense. That's an interactive feature. Matrices. These render by expanding the matrix and creating a row and column for each row and column at the lowest level of detail. Subtotal rows and columns don't have a column or row headings. List renders a record for each detail row or instance in the list. Subreport, parent item is repeated for each instance of the contents. So you could actually get some bloat with this one. Chart is rendered by creating a row for each chart value and then the member labels. And labels from series and categories and hierarchies are flattened and included in the row for a chart value. Okay, some fairly complex behavior there. Data bar and sparkline both render like a chart. Typically don't include hierarchies or labels. A gauge renders as a single record with minimum and maximum values of the linear scale, start and end values of the range, and the value of the pointer. An indicator renders as a single record with the active state name, available states, and the data value. And then a map. This renders a row with the labels and values for each map member of the map layer. If the map has multiple layers, the values in the rows vary depending on whether the map layers use the same or different map data regions. If multiple map layers use the same data region, the rows contain data from all layers. Okay, so that's only a quick overview of the differences, but the main point is that you're getting different data that is structured differently for the different items in your report. So really the message there, and I'm not really even done yet, the message here is that you want to make your reports as simple as possible if the users are going to be using this format. All right, hierarchical and group data has to be flattened to be represented in the CSV format. CSV is inherently a two-dimensional format. So the rendering extension flattens the report into a tree structure that represents the nested groups within a data region. All right, so Books Online defines the rules as a row hierarchy is flattened before a column hierarchy. Columns are ordered in a set order. Within a data region, the columns are ordered by corner members, row hierarchy members, column hierarchy members, and then cells. And peer data regions are data regions or dynamic groups that share a common data region or dynamic ancestor. And peer data is identified by branching of the flattened tree. Now, the CSV format, or the renderer, supports two modes. One is optimized to use the data in Excel, and the other is optimized for other third-party applications that require strict compliance with the CSV specification, and that's in RFC 4180. Because, unfortunately, as usual, Microsoft plays a bit fast and loose with that spec. So these modes affect the rendering of peer data regions. So in the default mode, this is the mode that's optimized for Excel. In this case, the report is rendered with multiple sections of data. Each peer data region is delimited by an empty line and as separate blocks of data. Numeric values are formatted in their formatted state, so currencies have a currency symbol, percentages include the percent sign, dates have the customary delimiters, and so on. And then there's compliant mode. This is the mode optimized for applications requiring strict adherence to the spec. In this case, only the first row of the file contains the column headers, and each row has the same number of columns. All of the values are unformatted. Now, to change to compliant mode, you'll have to edit rsReportServer.config, which changes the setting for all CSV reports exported on that server. Okay, so this is a global change. Okay, so who would have thought a text format could be so complex? I was actually surprised the first time that I dove into the rules for CSV files in reporting services. All right, but when you export the data and open it directly from Report Manager, the file will open in Excel if it's installed. If you want to open the file in a text editor or some other application, you'll need to save it to disk first and then go over to Windows Explorer and open it from there. All right, I'm going to fairly quickly look at the CSV that is generated for different report types. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time here because the data structures that are exported are highly dependent upon how you build the report. So just be aware, I'm going to show you some of the features, but the CSV export, the data structures that are exported are going to vary widely based on the kinds of reports. All right, so the first one I want to look at is company orders. All right, so this is basically a grouped row and column report. So I have grouping both in rows and in columns. So I'm going to export that to a CSV. Now if I open it directly, it opens in Excel, and that kind of hides the formatting. So I'm going to save that to my junk folder and come over here, company orders, and open this up with Notepad. Okay, so this is about as two-dimensional as you're going to get. The data lengths are different. There's a lot of repeated data values. You have the row headers at the top and so forth. It's very straightforward, rows and columns. It's about as simple as you're going to get with an export format. So what's interesting here is that reporting services, or specifically the CSV renderer, had to flatten the structure. so that all of those grouped rows and columns, I have a lot of repeats because of the grouping, but it flattens it into this two-dimensional structure. All right, then I'm going to come back over here. Let's close that. And look at the category sales by year. Now, this report uses 3 data visualizations to graphically indicate the sales data. So I'm going to export that to CSV. I just click Save. It should take me straight there. Yep, nope, that's the wrong one. No, it put it in the download format. Oh well, my bad. Let me do that again. I need to select Save As. I would sure prefer it remembered the last place, but that's asking too much apparently. So there we go. I'm going to open it up in Notepad again. Okay, now there is only a single set of data. There's a single set of row headers, and it uses all of the same data structure. But what's interesting here is that it has a lot of extra fields that are not used by all of the rows. So what's interesting here is that the different report items render the data in a different structure. So that's what's important about this example. So even though all of these rows use the same fields, the contents of each row is structured differently by what data is included based on the report element type or report item type each of these is rendering. Okay, and so the weird data here is basically the spark lines and the indicators. All right, back over here and close that and go back over here. And now I want to look at the sales chart. So this is a very simple chart that has 4 bars representing 4 years of sales. So this is kind of interesting. I'll export to CSV and I'll save it as. And there's sales chart. And as you can see, it exports just 4 lines of data. What this represents is the different columns of the chart. So it has the label for each of the rows, 2005, 6, and 7, and then the value of that bar. So I'll come over here, the columns, and then the value that's represented there. Because that's the core data that's being represented within this chart. It's been distilled down by the report renderer when I generate the report here. And then that's the raw data that is then exported to the CSV file. All right, so as you can see, most reports produce fairly clean and simple CSV data because none of these sample reports are overly complex. The moral of that story is that you are virtually always advised to keep report design as simple as possible while meeting user requirements, because then the report and its data is going to be as useful as possible to the widest variety of users. The next data exchange format that I want to talk about is the XML format. A report exported as XML data essentially takes the hierarchical structure of the report and tags it with XML element tags. Here's one place where it's important to carefully name all of the items in your report, because those item names become the names of the XML elements. Leaving a text box with the default text box 37 as its name is not going to produce useful XML. The XML file will contain all detail rows from the report, including hidden data if it's viewable in the HTML version of the report. Now, each type of report item has its own rendering behavior, and I'm not going to go through those here. It's kind of similar to the concepts in CSV, but customized for XML. So if you really want the nitty-gritty detail, and it is very nitty-gritty, you should check out the Books Online topic, Exporting to XML. It has all the details. Most importantly, some items render as separate elements, others as attributes, and some produce a whole subtree of XML. It really depends on how complex each report item is. To show you how Reporting Services exports XML, I'm going to use this reseller cumulative sales report. All right, there's a report. I'll select to export the XML and save as in my junk folder. And there's that exported file. So I'm going to open this up with Visual Studio. Visual Studio has nice support for working with XML files. And there's the data. So if you're really a masochist, you can scroll through this, keeping it on a single line. It's a lot of data. That's a pretty big report with a lot of pages. But the nice thing about Visual Studio is that it has support for formatting data with whitespace. So it's a little bit more human readable. The nice thing about Reporting Services is that it doesn't include any extraneous whitespace, which minimizes the size of the file. And so that's great if you're going to deploy this over a network. You could have many megabytes of data. So this is going to be the minimum file size. And there's various ways to minimize XML files as well. So what I'm going to do is come up here into Edit. And let's see, I usually just do Control-KD, which formats it. Format document right there. And what that does is it puts it in this nice, relatively human-readable format in its fully expanded state. And as you can see, I've actually changed the file because now there's a lot of white space. There are carriage return line feeds, and there's white space between some of the elements. Okay, so just real briefly about the structure of this XML. Root element is a report because this is a report format. So that's one of the relatively few standard named elements. That report has a tablix in it. I didn't change the name in the report because I was expecting my users of the report weren't going to export this. So I just left it at the default tablix 1. And then you can see there's also some empty text boxes here. And those have the names of the text boxes in the report itself. And then you can see I have a sales territory group collection, a sales territory group, a sales territory country collection. So these are actual names that I included within the report. I needed to name them in order to access them within the report. But then it adds this underscore collection to indicate that this is a collection element. And there's could be a number of sales territory countries here within it. And then there's a business type, details collection. So this is the details row. All of the detailed data within that report. And so I can scroll down and I'll see repeating versions of the same kind of structure of the data. All right, so as you can see, the export format is a mix of standard XML element names as well as names that were picked up from the report. Okay, now one more detail about this. These text boxes really are not actually empty, but they contain nested elements, at least down to this text box 31 element. Now, in this particular case, I happen to know and can tell you that text box 10 is the group column header label. But the XML format doesn't render child elements in this case. This is an example where the XML format doesn't render formatting and structured data, just the report data. So it essentially stripped out that header information in essence. And quite frankly, so far I haven't been able to figure out or find out why Microsoft includes the empty text boxes like that in the XML format. I suppose it conveys some information about the report structure, but without the contents of them, particularly if I don't rename them into meaningful names, it really isn't useful. It's just kind of bloating the XML. So be that as it may, you can ignore them as you're parsing the XML. You can ignore that kind of stuff. The last of the data exchange formats is the ATOM format. And this is based on the ATOM syndication format. And that's an XML-based web specification for exporting data for news feeds. If you use a newsreader like Feedly or the old Google Reader, which is no longer around, or any of the myriad other kinds of newsreaders to read ATOM or RSS feeds on the internet, then you're using this ATOM syndication format. So this is a useful way for importing data into other applications. For example, you could export a report as Atom and import it into PowerPivot for Excel, some other data analysis tool, or publish your data in various other ways. On the surface, this really is just another form of XML that is structured quite differently, though, from the XML output format that I just talked about. Each data region in the report becomes its own data feed. Now, the output file is actually an Atom service document with a file extension of .atom.svc. This file doesn't actually contain the report data. Instead, it contains a URL for each data feed from the report. And often you'll have just a single data feed, but you may have multiple data feeds. Okay, so this adds a layer of complexity to this format. I'm going to use this reseller cumulative sales report again to show this format. Now what's kind of interesting here is that if I go to the export button, I don't have anything for this Atom or RSS or anything that indicates this sort of feed. There's actually a dedicated button for it right there. As you can see, it exports to a data feed. Not terribly descriptive, but not sure why Microsoft included this as a separate toolbar button, but there it is. So I'll go ahead and click on that, and I get the usual open, save, or whatever. Notice that I'm going to save it as the name of the report, .atom.svc, as the report format. So I'll save that as in my junk folder, hop over there, and there's that report. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And I want to use Visual Studio. Oh, it doesn't show up. Hopefully the version selector will do the right thing, and it does. Doesn't always happen. Okay, I'm going to do Control-KD to format a little bit better. And there's the output. Now, once again, notice that there's no data here. If I scroll over, all that is a super long URL. But what this is this is the URL that you can access or use to access this particular feed. Again, this report, fairly simple report, has only a single data feed, so there's only a single URL. And when I go to this URL, it's going to return an XML document with the .atom file extension, not atom.svc, but atom, that contains the report data using rules kind of similar to those for the CSV renderer, but of course in XML. All right, so let's go ahead and do that, because there's a couple of gotchas here. So in fact, it'd probably be easier to show the gotchas here. So the problem is that, and I can't really move the cursor, but if you scan through this, notice that all of the ampersands have been converted to the ampersand AMP semicolon. All right, so that's not going to work within the browser. But don't take my word for it, I'll actually show you. So I'm going to copy that. So I did Control-C. I'll come over here to the browser. I'm done with that, so I'll close that. Open up a new tab. And paste that in. Okay, so I get an error. The report execution has expired or cannot be found. One of the cases where a Microsoft error message is highly uninformative. Okay, so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to open up Notepad and paste it in. And I'm very quickly going to come into this URL and change all of those ampersands to just, or ampersand amp semicolon, to just the ampersand. I think the other encoding here should be fine, but we'll find out. Hopefully I'll get them all. So, and strictly speaking, I've shown you the laborious process. Fortunately, oops, my keyboard control is not good. So I can do a copy and replacement. So I'm going to find that and replace it with just that, and I'll do it for all of them. Okay. So I want to show you the process, but all right. So now I'm going to go back to the beginning of it and copy it Hopefully that's enough of the changes. Go in here, paste it in, and go for it. All right, so now I'm getting this reseller cumulative sales.atom. I'm going to save that file, same location. And there's that atom file. I'll open it up in Visual Studio. Hopefully it'll do the right thing again. And once again, it's rendered with no unneeded white space. So I'll do Control-KD, and that will render it. Notice it's a huge document because this actually contains all of the data from that very large report. So the main difference here is that rather than using the XML renderer's formatting for its selection for element names and how it structures the XML data, it's using that atom specification in order to render the data. So now I can export this, I can send it to applications that understand the atom format. I can put it out on the web if that made any sense whatsoever. I can do whatever I can do with other atom-based feeds. But as you can tell, this takes a little bit of extra work to work with the data itself. So you're really only going to use this format if you're going to import it into some other application.